Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I don't know if it's afternoon or morning for you, but we're very happy to have you with us at the HUMA Book Launch Seminar Series taking place at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. My name is Amina Slimani, and I'm a doctoral research fellow at HUMA. And today I'm really delighted to be hosting Prof. Barbara Boswell to speak on her latest book, Lauretta, Ngcobo, Writing as the Practice of Freedom. Barbara Boswell is a writer and feminist literary scholar who's an associate professor of English at the University of Cape Town, where she heads the Department of English Literary Studies. She's the author of Grace, a novel. She's the winner of the UG Creative Writing Prize for debut fiction. And she's the author of And Wrote My Story Anyway, Black South African Women's Novels as Feminism, which was shortlisted for the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences Award and longlisted for the Sunday Times Alain Paton Literary Award. Welcome, Barbara. We're really delighted to have you with us to celebrate the birth of this book and also the memory of the great South African novelist and essayist Lauretta Ngcobo. We're also delighted to have with us Sindiswa Busuku, who's a writer and a lecturer in the Department of English, joining us as a discussant for the book. So I wouldn't delay it further. Prof. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amina. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you to Huma and Divine Fu and you, Amina, and all your associates for hosting us today. We're very thrilled to be here. I am, at least. So thanks for providing this platform to talk about this work. I'm Barbara Boswell, and I compiled the collection that we're celebrating today, Lauretta Ngcobo, Writing as the Practice of Freedom. And it consists of selected writings by Lauretta Ngcobo in the form of her essays and also interviews with her that other people conducted and published. And the first part of the book then is my writing or framing of her life story and situating her life and her own writing within the political context of South African history and also the global history within which she is located. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the genesis of the book and how I came upon the idea of writing it. So it's important to note that this book is part of a series of works published by HSRC Press, the Human Sciences Research Council's press, which has a series called Voices of Liberation. And it started off with works, biographies, and which compiles the written work of people such as Frantz Fanon, Mafeje, etc. And this Lauretta Ngcobo, Writing as the Practice of Freedom, is part of a series on prominent South African women. And I think this book is supplemented by works on Fatima Meer, Miriam Tladi, and Wangari Maathai by Grace Musila. So it's one in a series, and it's a really exciting series because it's what it aims to do, the series, is to bring into prominence and into people's consciousness the works of important people who wrote and who were activists for freedom for us in South Africa and on the continent as well of Africa. So this project on Ngcobo, who is perhaps best known as a novelist, but was also a formidable literary critic, started for me when I was doing my PhD dissertation in Maryland at the University of Maryland. And she was one of the writers that I looked at for my PhD research. My research was on Black South African women's writing and how they engage with the nation, the construct of the nation through their fiction, and how they theorize feminism and liberation in their works of fiction. And so Ngcobo is, for me, quite a significant writer and activist. She was part of a group of people who could be considered, I think, indirectly one of the founder members of the Pan-Africanist Congress, because her husband, A.B. Ngcobo, was one of the founders. and she was, as his partner and wife, quite embedded in that project as well. And the biography that the part of the text or the book that is the biography, which I wrote, comes from looking at her life, her birth. She was born in 1931 in Ngcobo in the Natal province, and she died in 2015. So she lived into her 80s. And during this time, she was an activist, she was a teacher, she was a mother, she was a wife, a daughter, and also then became a writer. She wrote two significant works of fiction, Cross of Gold, published in 1981, and They Didn't Die, published in 1990. The first novel really inaugurated her as one of the foundational Black South African women writers, along with Miriam Tladi, who had published Muriel at Metropolitan in 1975, and Bessie Head. So I place her in the company of these women writers in establishing a canon of South African, Black South African feminist writing. What her second novel then did, the first novel was quite critiqued by feminists. She was embedded within certain feminist networks globally and African feminisms. And her first novel, Cross of Gold, is about a freedom fighter and going into exile. And the only character who is a strong woman in the novel, Cindy Siwe, dies in the first chapter. And so a lot of the critique that she got in terms of reviews of that novel spoke to the fact that the only woman character who is really an agent dies. And so her second novel then, she writes about a host of women in rural KwaZulu-Natal, and they do not die, and hence the title of the second novel, And They Didn't Die. They go on to become political activists, and they make quite a lot of change in the reserve where they are situated. And Ngcobo's second novel really has become a feminist classic, an African feminist classic. It is published by multiple publishers. It has editions, the NYU Press, New York, the Feminist Press of NYU, in New York University. It has British publishers. It has South African publishers, and it's taught quite globally. The other thing that I sought to highlight, besides her contribution to literary studies, is her contribution to literary criticism. So she was a really excellent writer of Black South African histories of literature. And she used various journals, platforms, and edited collections to write the narrative, to insert into history the erased narrative of Black writing in South African literature. So this was a project of hers during the 1980s. In one of the collections that she wrote, Let It Be Told, Writing by Black Women in Britain, she gathered other Black women writers and marshaled them in this project of writing the experiences of what it's like to be a Black woman writer and immigrant in the 80s in Britain. Her second edited collection is called Prodigal Daughters, Stories of South African Women in Exile. And I happen to be teaching from this edited collection at the moment in our undergraduate curriculum. And in this one, she also gathered the stories and edited the stories of South African women who had been in exile during apartheid. This edited collection was published in 2012. Ngcobo also was quite a writer who was self-consciously writing herself into history, because she would write and publish articles in literary journals talking about her experiences and her process as a writer. So she made very clear the obstacles that she faced as a Black woman in becoming published. the sexism that she suffered in her family, where her voice was discounted because she was a woman. And at Fort Hare University, which was one of 35 women, one of the first cohorts of women to be taken into that university, and was one of very few in the classroom, and had to fight to have her voice heard. And also then the sexism and racism that she experienced from publishers, both in Britain and globally, and in South Africa as well. So the book really looks at her life and tries to create some sort of narrative around what she did with her life in terms of being a writer. Ngcobo was also a politician. So when she returned from exile after 31 years into South Africa, she became an MEC, a provincial MEC member, not an MEC, a member of parliament of the provincial legislature of KwaZulu-Natal, and for the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and she worked in that capacity for 10 years. So she was quite a phenomenal and very active citizen. And she reinvented herself several times during her life and during her career where she could make the most impact. I'll speak a little bit more about the process of writing the narrative that foregrounds most of her writing in this book. And I had the good fortune of meeting Lauretta Ngcobo's daughter, youngest daughter, Kethiwe, in Johannesburg. And we were discussing this project. I asked for permission if the family would be happy with me doing this book. And they were mostly happy. And as I was working through my own research and trying to piece together a story of Mrs. Ngcobo's life, Kethiwe mentioned to me just by the way, there's a box of papers of my mother's in my house, but I don't know what's in it. And so, of course, I jumped at the chance and begged her to have a look at the box. And I spent some time with Kethiwe Ngcobo in Johannesburg, and we went painstakingly through this personal archive. And it was quite astounding because what it afforded me was an incredible glimpse into her process of working, her letter writing. She corresponded, for example, with Robert Sobukwe, and she had copies of letters that he had written her. She had correspondence, she had saved correspondence that she did with her literary agent. She had saved correspondence that she did with various publishing houses, including David Phillip, the Heinemann African Writers Series. So she had left a fascinating personal archive, royalty statements, letters to contributors to the edited collections. And from this, one could get a glimpse into the kind of determination that was required for her to launch herself as a writer, because she was mothering 4 daughters, she was teaching full-time, she was a headmistress or the principal at a school in England, in London, for a lot of her career. And during the downtimes that she had, she carved out very specific spaces for writing when the children were asleep or after they went to school. And I recently met with another of her daughters who said, well, she really binge wrote during the school holidays, and she would just put us on a program and say, you go do this. And that's when she got most of her writing done. So I think there are fascinating insights into her life gained from her personal archive. She was an incredibly courageous person. She writes about how she moved into exile when her husband was a treason trialist, how she was being chased by police, and what went into her decision of going into exile. And then the capacity that she needed in order to relaunch her life and relaunch the lives of her children in a foreign country, and moved through several foreign countries to Zambia and Swaziland before she was able to settle her family in England. So all of these things, all of these strands of her story come together to produce a very rich narrative of a life of utter determination, of an unflinching quest for freedom. and an unflinching and unapologetic desire to take other women, other Black women with her in that quest for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Boswell, for this really great introduction to the book. I'm personally very excited to read it as soon as I get back to South Africa. And I think it's quite an incredible project to have access to someone that you thought about and thought with since your PhD, and to have access not only to their to what they've written, but also to their archive. And I think I have a question, but I'd really love to ask it after Sindiswa's discussion segment. So Sindiswa, I'll leave the floor to you, and I'll keep my questions for later.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And so I'm very, very honored to be in conversation with you about this fantastic book that you've written. It's a great privilege, and I learned so much from reading the book. But just to take a step back, I think it's important for us to sort of appreciate the fact that you've been tremendously productive in these last years. And I want to talk about your sort of journey, because you've written Grace, that was published by Mujaji and was the winner of the UJ Prize, as was mentioned earlier. And then you wrote And I Wrote My Story Anyway, Black South African Women Novels as Feminism, published by Wits University Press in 2020, which was longlisted for the NIHSS Best Nonfiction Edited Volume. And today we have the privilege of discussing Lauretta Ngcobo Writing as the Practice of Freedom, which I'm
Oh, Cindy, I think you're on mute. I can't hear you, sorry.
I can't hear her either. Sindiswa, can you hear us? We might have lost your sound.
Oh dear.
Sindiswa, can you hear us?
I see that her microphone has been muted.
Amina, can you just wave to her or something like that?
Yep.
Yes.
Well,
If she's looking at the screen or something.
Cindy. Sindiswa, I'm so sorry, but your microphone has been on mute for half of the question. So we couldn't hear you. I'm not sure if it's a problem with the microphone or with another technical problem. Can you just speak again, please?
Oh, did you hear none of that?
I heard the first half of the question. You mentioned the 3 books and then it went to mute. So I'm not sure. This is the thing with live things, yeah.
Oh, no. Okay, sorry about that technical issue. So I'm sure that Lauretta Ngcobo's writing as the Practice of Freedom will go on to scoop even more awards and acclaim. And so I want to begin I want this conversation to be a critical and creative meditation that thinks through Lauretta Ngcobo's life and her living literary legacy as a Black South African woman writer. And so I also want to open it up to everybody that's gathered here. Please write your comments so that we can also engage with your thoughts and open up a conversation beyond just my voice. But I want to begin by saying that what I found most powerful about this book is that I feel that there is a creative, critical, cultural and intellectual labor and practice taking place in this particular offering. And I want to think sensitively about the ways in which this work does the work of dealing with representation, the restoration, redress, recovery, and responses to the way in which Lauretta Ngcobo is remembered in the literary landscape. So I want to start with a seemingly simple question, but I'm sure for you it's incredibly complex, because I want to know why Lauretta Ngcobo, and what was it about her writing that resonated so deeply with you looking back?
Right. I mean, yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for framing the project in the way that you have, Cindy. I think, as I mentioned, my dissertation looked at Black women's writing and fiction specifically as part of national discourse and a way of entering into national discourse when they were denied political rights. So writing fiction or writing biography was often a way of inserting a voice into national discourse around issues of oppression. And I think I was really fascinated by her because she was so under, very few people had written criticism on her, and she's unknown in South African letters, as are most Black women writers, although that is very rapidly changing after the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movements at universities in South Africa. But I was especially mesmerized by her second novel, And They Didn't Die, which I think is a very complex and sophisticated literary interpretation or literary rendering of the feminist theory of intersectionality. And so I think she really does an incredible job in that novel of showing the effects of the 1913 Land Act on women specifically and on African families, and how families and lives are destroyed by that dispossession of women and men and children from the land, which is their birthright. So the novel for me was really, really an important one in my own development as a thinker and a writer, because it allowed me to see the ways in which one can become a feminist theorist or advance feminist theory, not only through writing theory, which I was immersed in, but through writing fiction, which I think is more accessible to a larger number of people. I also had the privilege of meeting Lauretta Ngcobo while I was doing my PhD research, and I'm going to tell the story again. A lot of people are tired of hearing it, but I visited her in Durban in her home, and found it to be such a kind, warm, and generous person. And she, when she heard that I had nowhere to stay, well, I didn't have nowhere to stay. I hadn't booked a hotel, so I was leaving her house after spending a morning with her, interviewing her and chatting. And she made me lunch, and she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm going to just sort of wander around until I find a hotel and check in." And she said, no, you'll do no such thing. And she allowed me to sleep over in her guest bedroom. And then she made me, sent me on my way the next morning to the airport. It was just for me kind of such a beautiful and warm gesture. And there are many reasons why a particular writer just grabs us and grabs hold of our imagination. And I was given the opportunity to write or to produce. I wouldn't call it writing, because half of the book really are edited, her words, her own essays and excerpts from her books. But to produce this. And she was the first writer that came to mind, because I thought, she deserves to be remembered. She deserves to have a larger legacy than she has. And if I have a small a platform to produce something that will make her be remembered and make her work current again, this would be an honor for me to do. I also teach her work, and so I always want to spread the word about her work and what she had done with her life at a time against incredible odds.
And just following on from the sort of odds and the stakes that were that she had to face, reading this book, listening to how she was under surveillance from the special branch, how she had to leave suddenly and make split-second decisions about whether to stay or whether to leave. Could you just talk to us, for those of us in the room that perhaps don't understand the sort of context and the conditions under which Lauretta Ngcobo had to grapple and make decisions about her future?
Yeah, thank you. This is quite a fortuitous question, because I was just this morning giving a lecture. I wonder if any of my second year students are here about this. And she was, you know, it was 1963 and her husband was a treason trialist, and she had 3 children at that stage, I think under the age of 5 or 6 years old. And she was a teacher in Sydenham, I think, in the Natal province, a high school teacher. And she had passed on information in the form of a letter or a note from her husband in prison to someone else in the PAC in Durban after she had visited him in Pretoria. And she was being surveilled all the time by the special branch. And she then heard that they were interviewing her students, you know, the police, to ask what was she teaching them. And they had apparently found a note in her handwriting and were getting ready. She got word that she was going to be arrested on a specific day. And on that day, she had to decide whether she was going to be arrested and have her 3 children have both parents in prison, or whether she was going to flee. And she decided to flee the country to Swaziland. She took a train from Durban at 11 o'clock at night. But the really terrible part about this is that, of course, as an exile, she couldn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't say goodbye to her children, her mother, and she was living at this time with her brother Putuma, because he was kind of like protecting her in a way, since her husband Abi was in prison. And so she writes in Prodigal Daughters how she came home from school that day. She pretended to be cooking and in a clandestine way packed her bags and smuggled them out and left them in the garden. And Putuma, she was sure, could see that something was not right with her, but she couldn't tell him for his own safety that she was leaving. And, you know, I think about what it must have taken to leave 3 very young children behind in this way, the courage that it must have taken. And she just did that in order to secure her family in a way, and to enable the movement to continue in exile. And without consulting anyone, she had to do that. So she had to make these really heartrending decisions as a young woman, a young mother, without the inputs of anyone, and had to take her life into her hands really and do that. And part of what I think there's a sense of wistfulness, because when she left and when she was a child even, she had always written, but she destroyed all of her writing as she left Durban. So a lot was lost at that time. You know, and this made her even more determined then, when she was more settled in England, to become a writer and write for posterity.
Sure. I hope that your students are here, because your course is super exciting, and you write about women, gender, and exile, and you teach the Prodigal Daughters. I think it's really important to think about, on page 68 of the book, let me see, 68. And the reason that I want to think about page 68 is because tomorrow would be the 16th of August, and it will be a decade since the Marikana massacre. And Lauretta Ngcobo in Prodigal Daughters, Lauretta Ngcobo speaks to the Marikana massacre, and she used her voice to address that and used her work to continue that conversation. And she writes on page 68, "I didn't think I'd live to see another Sharpeville. This was worse because the faces of those shooting were Black. We thought we'd overcome apartheid, but the disease, the germs of apartheid have entered us. Our people are eating one another. You wouldn't think a person who has suffered so much in history would turn around and destroy other Black people." I just wonder, as we are thinking about Marikana and remembering Marikana and Lauretta Ngcobo speaking so powerfully, it seems that, it's now more than ever more important that we remember Lauretta Ngcobo and her place within the literary landscape. What do you think about the ways in which she used her voice to talk about current situations?
Well, I think what is so interesting about her is that her voice changes so much, and she was so skilled at being able to produce different genres and different types of writing. So while in exile, she was a novelist and she was an essayist. When she returned to South Africa after 1990, after 31 years in exile, both her and her husband, Abi, were committed to making South Africa their home and to contributing. And they returned and she writes a number of very powerful essays during the interregnum, writing about women and women's movements and what awaits women in the so-called new South Africa, and what we should be mindful of at that juncture in history as we're moving into democracy, what will happen to women. And it's very prescient because she says the scourge of apartheid, we have defeated it, but will we ever be able to defeat the scourge of violence against women and the scourge of patriarchy and the concomitant discrimination. So she looks to the future at that point, while she's very happy that the apartheid state has been dismantled. She also very poignantly reflects in 1994 on her first opportunity to cast her ballot in South Africa. And at this stage, she's over 60 years old and she votes for the first time. And, she makes a very powerful, trenchant critique of the Nationalist Party government and how they have written these sunset clauses into the settlements that they procured during negotiations, and how people were retiring, people who were responsible for a lot of violence and suffering and death were retiring with rich pensions and so on. So she was a powerful writer in the way in which she would always critique power. And with Marikana, similarly, this piece that you quoted from is an op-ed that she wrote, that she did in the Natal Witness, I think, after Marikana. And she is completely sickened by it and cannot fathom how in democratic South Africa this was able to happen, the recurrence of a Sharpeville massacre. So she continued to use her voice and her position in order to critique systems of violence and oppression. And I think that really didn't end until very late in her life. As long as she was able, she was doing that. And I mean, she also had a very, in one of her essays, she writes about a woman near where she lived in Ulundi being accused of witchcraft and murdered. And she unpacks that situation and says, this kind of violence only accrues to working class women because you don't see well-educated, young Black women being singled out as witches and tortured and maimed and killed in this way. It is older working class women. And so she writes very, very pointedly about the new kinds of apartheid and the new forms of structural violence that are emerging in the new nation.
Thank you, sure. I don't want to take up too much time and I want to open it up soon, but I just have two more questions and then I'll zip it. Um, so I want to talk about this provocative, open-handed, inviting subtitle to the book. The subtitle of this work invites us all to critically and creatively think about writing as the practice of freedom. So what does this richly suggestive subtitle mean to you? And what do you hope that it incites in us as readers and writers?
Well, it really comes, well, you can see I borrowed it from Paulo Freire, Education as the Practice of Freedom. So there's a bit of intertextuality there, but also that when I interviewed her, she reflected on this, and she said, in my first book, when I wrote this character, Sindisiwe, who dies in the first chapter, that was how constrained my imagination was. My imagination was constrained by my patriarchal upbringing, who could not imagine a powerful woman living long. And so she had to die. And then she went on to say, but as I wrote, and they didn't die, as I wrote that book, I started writing my own freedom, because as this character, Jazile is the main character, becomes more and more bold, and she acts without the permission of her husband, without the permission of her mother-in-law. She takes these really bold steps to do things with her life. And Mrs. Ngcobo reflected, as I was writing this character, I wrote my own freedom, because I then became bold. And she even says in this interview, my husband he had a hard time with it a little bit. He couldn't understand where this new, different woman was coming out of, but writing it created for her a space of freedom. And so and that is where the title, the subtitle comes from. And I suppose it's also an invitation to those of us who are writers, or who want to write, or are aspirant writers, or who don't even think that we are writers, but secretly we are, that writing can be a tool of freeing ourselves and others. I mean, I know there's a lot of critique, and I can hear some of my friends saying, oh, you're sitting in the ivory tower and saying writing is freedom. But it is one of the ways in which ideas, and powerful ideas, can be set down and can be distributed and disseminated amongst us, and can have a small impact.
Lovely. I love the title, and I think that it's an incredible invitation and a provocation at the same time. And it's generative. So I continue to be very interested in the relationship between the visual and the verbal. And in this beautiful book, you've got a photo gallery that starts on page 69 and it goes all the way through. So I was just wondering, thinking about this this beautiful gallery, what did this access to Ngcobo's visual archive do to inform your thinking and writing? Just having these images of her and her family, and what did that do to inform and shape your writing?
Well, it's such an interesting question, because I'm not a visual person. I don't, I look at text and I'm not really, but then as I visited Ketiwe, the youngest daughter of Mrs. Ngcobo, the whole time we had a beautiful interaction, because we have sons who are the same age, and our sons were together with us, and we were all going through these papers together and talking about them and so on. And Kitty was making a film about her mother's life, and so she kind of used me as a talking head to talk about the literary stuff. But it was like this treasure trove that Ketiwe kept then saying, oh, well, here we have these photos and here we have this and here's this. So she kept almost forgetting what was there and then bringing it forth as we conversed. We spent a whole weekend together going through this box and talking and writing and so on. I think that the photos, the first thing that struck me is that really, it was really atypical. If you look at some of the earliest photos, there are photos of Mrs. Ngcobo when she's about 19 years old in her first year at Fort Hare, and these beautiful portraits. So there are quite a lot of pictures of her. There are pictures even of her grandparents that were extremely important. The picture of the grandparents was mounted on Ketiwe's wall. And I felt these were extremely precious objects, artifacts, and part of the family history that Ketiwe was inviting me to access. And it was such a privilege to be able to see these images, and especially the images of Lauretta's grandparents, because she roots so much of her own storytelling and her own compulsion to tell stories within her great-grandmother and grandmother, and there's a very palpable sense when you read her work that she inherited this, and this is a family tradition, the oral tradition of poetry, singing, and storytelling, which was passed down at a very, very early age to her. And so I think these relationships that the photos enliven or animate in a way are so important for us for understanding her work, her inspiration. And the other thing that I found in the box, which broke my heart, were at least 2 works that were incomplete. One was a series of essays she was writing on prominent women in Zulu culture. And then there was another project on mythology, Zulu mythology. And she was busy working on these projects when she died. She died without finishing these works. And it's very sad to reflect on, had she not had such a tumultuous life, what more may she have produced? Because, had she just been able to sit down and write and have the privilege and luxury of writing, she may have been much more prolific. On the other hand, it is her struggle that shaped her as a writer very profoundly, and which makes her such a powerful feminist voice. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I've gone off on quite a tangent there.
No, that was perfect. And in terms of her books being in print, last question, promise. The reprinting of her book, the availability of her book, talk to us about that.
Well, also what I found very poignant and sad, and it made me cry as a writer, her first book, Cross of Gold, went out of print maybe 6 years after it was published, and she begged the publisher, please redo it. There's a great demand for the book, and it was never brought back into print. And she wrote David Philip, she wrote publishers in Ghana, she wrote publishers in Zimbabwe, please republish Cross of Gold. And she never ever got it back into print. She even wrote a foreword to it for a second edition, but a publisher never took it up. And I read these impassioned letters that she wrote to publishers saying, please, don't let this book go out of print and out of history. It's important. She believed in this work. And it is still not in print. And her second novel, And They Didn't Die, in South Africa also is out of print now. It's published by UKZN Press. So if there's anyone here from UKZN Press, please redo it. We are still teaching it and prescribing it. So, I just spoke to another friend of mine over the weekend who's a writer who said, my novel is being pulped because it's now 3 or 4 years later. And this is what happens in South Africa, unfortunately, when the demand for the book declines, it falls out of circulation. And so even her second novel now is quite difficult to get a copy of in South Africa, although I do believe the feminist press in New York probably, it's probably quite prolifically still available there, which is ironic. I mean, I could find a lot of these writers' works that I worked on for my dissertation in the USA. You could buy them on eBay, books that had gone out of print, but you can't find them in South Africa, which is a shame.
Definitely. On that note, I think we should open it up to the floor. Amina, are you going to take questions or should I?
Absolutely. So we welcome anyone who's willing to ask a question to raise their hand. Should be able to unmute them, and they could ask their question directly, or you could also send your question through the chat. I had a question that I would love to ask. Thank you so much. Actually, it was really beautiful to hear about this labor of love, and also the background and context behind it. And I really love this notion of reinvention that you mentioned that Lauretta went through in terms of her own identities in different spaces and in different times. And I was wondering about what are some specific learnings for those of us who have not read the book and who will read it. What are the specific learnings that we can take from Lauretta to think about the ways in which we can write for freedom today, considering the multiple contextual experiences we go through on the continent and in South Africa? So I'm asking this question as someone who's not part of the South African context and who's not very or as familiar with it.
Yeah, well, I think, thank you for your question, Amina. I think writing for freedom really, as she may have thought of it and in the context of the continent, is she really tackled oppressive systems and oppression head on in her writing and in her fiction specifically. And I think the lesson that we can take from it, where she encountered and saw and experienced and lived and saw happening to others injustice, that was what really compelled her to write. And I think there's so many contexts where that, of course, we're on this continent and in the world, there's so much that we can be writing against. I mean, I just read, over the weekend, this really awful event of the author Salman Rushdie being attacked and stabbed on a public platform, and I read the words that he gave at a statement he gave to PEN, which is a freedom of expression global institute for writers, who says this: we at a stage, I mean, we've always been, but there are very strong oppressive forces at work globally. In the United States, we see the resurgence of a very conservative right-wing push to dominate Black bodies, women's bodies, queer lives. Similarly, there are these oppressive forces that take their cue almost from there in certainly on the continent, and there are different forces at move here also. But the voices against oppression and oppressive systems that dehumanize, and seek to destroy lives, there are plenty of opportunities to write about that today.
Thank you so much for the response. Once again, if you have a question, please do send it in the chat or raise your hand using the bottom reaction tool. I also wanted to quickly ask a question about how does Lauretta exist in your consciousness and imagination today after you finished this work? Because I guess there's some kind of intimacy and proximity that you have, considering that you've met her in person and wrote about her for this project. So I was a bit curious about that.
I don't know, that's a very difficult question to answer, because any kind of way in which I think of her now is probably a projection. I don't know if that's correct, but I do certainly feel very grateful that she existed and for the work that she does, because it's enabled people like me to do the work that I do today. You know, they made the path for other women to follow. And I'm also very grateful for the family of Lauretta, especially her two daughters whom I've met, and I've become friends with one of her daughters. And we're, you know, I feel very grateful that they have, they gave me their blessing to do this work, and they helped me to do it. And I think they're so proud of their mother. And it's just been really special to have a kind of a relationship with her daughters, and to see them really being very, very delighted that she's being remembered and honored, I think, in this way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yep.
I see a question by A. Jamal Binden. Is your course mandatory as to help deal with the challenges of being woke in a post-apartheid society? I don't know what that question means. I think my course is not mandatory. You know, people choose to register for our courses at the university. I mean, I don't know what the challenges of being woke are. I can't answer that. Another question from Lenina Rasul. Hello, Lenina. Barbara Boswell spoke about sexism and racism experienced by the author back then, given the unavailability of books by Black women authors now. Are we still seeing this? You know, I think that's a great question, Lenina. There's been a lot more opportunities for Black women to write and be published, but I think the industry in South Africa, it's still very small, and it's quite I feel like almost it's a gate-kept industry, and it's very difficult to break into it. I think there are structural barriers to Black people and Black women specifically, and queer Black people to get into those spaces of being published. There are certainly many more people now, and we don't have those repressive laws like the Suppression of Communism Act. We don't have the censorship board. We don't have those kinds of tools that really violently silenced people. But certainly it is a difficult industry to break into, and there are structures that I think keep certain people out and promote other people within it. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Thanks, Lenina.
I don't know if, yeah, I saw a hand by Maria earlier, but then it disappeared. I'm not sure. And then I see Sandy's hand.
Hi, Barbara. The question I wanted to ask you, I mean, I was so moved by your account now of the way in which, well, in a couple of moments, you describe how Lauretta Ngcobo spoke of how she started writing her own freedom through this fiction, and what an extraordinary testament her writing was to intersectionality, and just the way in which my question is to you about the work that you have done in recognizing the theorizing that is possible through fiction. You know, as scholars, I hear in your account just a tremendous respect for the work of fiction writers, and of course you are yourself a fiction writer. And I wondered if your engagement with Lauretta Ngcobo and her work has shifted your own sense of the efficacy of fiction to do this very sophisticated, politically powerful work, imaginatively powerful work, interventionist work that as scholars we might only ever dream of, in a way. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. That's such a complex question and very difficult to answer, Sandy. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think also, you know, I was meeting with a student this morning about their project, and we were talking about how the writer that he's looking at, whose work he's looking at, Chimamanda Adichie, by the way, has been taken up on other platforms, social media, critiques of her on social media, blog posts and so on, Twitter. You know, there's a whole nother sphere. I mean, and her work has been inserted in a Beyonce song. So, you know, once you get to be quoted by Beyonce, you know, I don't think there's anything higher than that. So there are ways in which information circulates. Certainly fiction has the capacity to do that. I don't know where fiction, you know, where we are making those interventions, though, those of us who write fiction as theory, because we are told we're really not a nation that reads very much, and people can't afford to buy books and so on. And we, even as a writer of fiction, you are still writing, or creative writing is writing for a very elite, you know, set of people. It may be a bit wider than people who read academic texts, but it's still a very elite place to be intervening in. So I'm not really sure, the older I get, of the efficacy of fiction anymore, but I think it's really just important to write beautiful and politically important work. So and there are other ways. I mean, people are using social media, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Those are new and exciting modes of theorizing, I would argue also. Thanks for your question, Sandy. There's another question from A. Jamal Binden again. Do you expect folks to become advocates from reading such works? In other words, what do you expect or want from individual students from reading your book or taking your class? Woke means aware of race issues. Thank you for clarifying what you mean by woke, because I've seen it used quite pejoratively recently. So I don't expect anything from my students other than to read the work. And I don't expect them to become advocates. I think what people become is up to them, and what their own capacities are and what they want to do and their own agency. So my task, I see my task as teaching, I think, important texts. And I think I see my task as introducing students at this university, you know, which is the only place where I teach at the moment, to expand what they consider to be South African literature. We teach African literature and we teach South African literature from a global perspective, from being situated within the world. And so what we teach and what I teach, I expect students to engage politically and critically with works. That's all I expect from them. I don't have any kind of mission to that they must go out and be advocates. What is very powerful about an education, and a good education, is that it enables you to unlock the thing inside of you that you need to do in the world, if you're lucky. And so my hope really is that these works will help to have our students think critically about the world in which they live, how it came to be the way it is, why 80% of our citizens are still living in poverty, why we have 64% youth unemployment. You know, if they can connect the dots to where we are now and to what has come before and how people have seen these events as intersecting, I think that is my aim as a teacher.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that really powerful explanation. I know that we've just reached the 5 p.m. dot, but there was a final question by Maria. Maria, could you please ask your question, and then we'll have Prof respond, and we'll wrap up the session. You are unmuted, I think. Yeah, please go ahead. I'm not sure we can hear you. Perhaps if you could try sending it through the chats, if that's easier or more feasible. Okay. Okay, she's saying she'll type the question. So I'll read it out as soon as it comes. Prof Boswell, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the session and get to that last question?
No, just my heartfelt thanks to everyone who's taken an hour out of your busy Monday to listen to this, and thank you again to Huma, and thank you especially to Sindiswa Busuku, who has been such a generous respondent to my talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And where can people find your book?
The book is available at exclusive bookstores and also at independent bookstores like the Book Lounge and Clark's Bookshop in Cape Town, and then in Johannesburg at there are a number of bookstores that have them, the Bridge Bookstore and Capital Circle Books in Johannesburg, but generally exclusive books.
Okay, perfect. Well, I hope everyone can go and get their copy this week. I'm sorry, Maria, we couldn't get to your question, but perhaps you could send it directly to Prof Boswell. I'm sure she would generously respond via email. I want to thank you so much for your generosity in sharing and for this beautiful discussion. Sindiswa, for your really critical questions that helped some of us who haven't read the book yet to really be grounded in the context that is much older than us. Thank you for joining this Huma book launch seminar. We also have seminars happening this week, the Ataya seminars with Dr. Atakliti Baraki, Bridging Humanities and Medicine, and our next Huma book launch next Monday is with Majid Hanoum on the invention of the Maghreb between Africa and the Middle East. And I also want to mention that there is an exhibition opening happening today at the African Century Studies Gallery. It's on the lives of Marikana. And you may need to RSVP, so just check out our calendar on Huma and you'll be able to see the email for RSVP. And thank you so much, everyone, and I wish you a great week ahead. And thank you again, Prof. Boswell and Sindiswa.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank